Some stories are not found in history books, but in the margins of surveyor logs and the silence of declassified archives. There is a specific kind of stillness in the Appalachian wilderness that suggests something was once there and was meticulously removed. The account of Arthur Penhaligon remains the only surviving record of a valley that, by all official accounts, never existed. The year was 1958, and the air in the high Appalachians was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Arthur Penhaligon led a 3-man surveying team through a region of the Blue Ridge that the federal government had marked as primary forest. Their task was simple: map the drainage basins of the untapped timberland for a proposed access road. The forest was dense, the canopy so thick that the sun struggled to reach the moss-covered floor, creating a perpetual emerald twilight. By the 4th day, the team noted a strange discrepancy in their instruments. The magnetic north on their transit compasses began to drift, pulling toward a valley that didn't appear on the master topographical sheets. They followed a dry creek bed, pushing through thickets of mountain laurel that seemed unnaturally tangled. The silence here was absolute, devoid of the usual birdsong or the rustle of small game in the underbrush. As they rounded a jagged limestone outcropping, the forest ended with an unnatural, surgical precision. Before them lay a shallow basin, nearly half a mile across, that was not filled with trees, but with a massive slab of poured concrete. At the center sat a long, low-slung facility with high, windowless walls that shimmered a dull gray in the fading light. Huge industrial ventilation shafts rose from the roof, their rusted fans spinning slowly in the mountain breeze. The team stood at the edge of the concrete apron, their boots echoing loudly against the artificial surface. There were no signs, no flags, and no visible entrance on the north-facing wall. Penhaligon circled the perimeter, noting that the concrete was seamless, as if the entire structure had been cast in a single, massive operation. Despite the size of the building, there were no tire tracks, no power lines, and no paths leading into the surrounding woods. Near the base of the western wall, they found a series of heavy steel hatches recessed into the concrete. One of the men, a junior surveyor named Miller, knelt to inspect the seals, noting they were covered in a thin layer of crystalline salt. When he pressed his ear to the metal, he didn't hear the hum of machinery, but a low, rhythmic pulsing that felt like it was coming from deep underground. It was a vibration that resonated in the chest more than the ears. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the temperature in the valley plummeted with impossible speed. The team retreated to the tree line to set up a cold camp, unwilling to light a fire that might draw attention to their position. Penhaligon sat in the dark, sketching the facility's dimensions into his field notebook by the light of a dim lantern. He noted that the building's architecture felt misplaced, lacking the utilitarian aesthetic of the 1950s military. The next morning, the valley was swallowed by a fog so thick they could barely see their own hands. They attempted to approach the facility again, but the concrete apron was slick with a strange oily residue that hadn't been there the night before. Miller found a discarded clipboard near one of the hatches, its pages blank except for a series of hand-drawn atmospheric charts. The charts depicted pressure systems that didn't correspond to any known local weather patterns. Penhaligon decided they needed to document the site with the government liaison back at the base camp. They marked their trail with red surveyor's tape, tying the plastic strips tightly to the branches of ancient oaks. As they climbed out of the valley, Penhaligon looked back one last time, seeing only the tips of the ventilation shafts piercing the fog. He felt a profound sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by the very structure itself. The hike back to the trailhead took nearly 2 days of grueling travel through the dense terrain. Upon reaching the ranger station, Penhaligon immediately placed a call to the regional director of the U.S. Geological Survey. He described the facility, the concrete basin, and the strange vibrations they had experienced. The director was silent for a long moment before telling Penhaligon to remain at the station and speak to no one. 6 hours later, a black sedan arrived, carrying a man who identified himself only as an administrative coordinator. He took Penhaligon's field notebooks and the blank charts Miller had recovered from the site. The man's demeanor was calm, almost bored, as he explained that the team had likely stumbled upon an old, abandoned quarry. Penhaligon protested, pointing out that quarries did not have industrial ventilation or subterranean pulses. The coordinator insisted that the team lead them back to the site the following morning for a formal inspection. Penhaligon agreed, confident that the red surveyor's tape would lead them directly to the concrete basin. They spent the night in the station's bunkhouse, the air filled with an uneasy tension. Penhaligon couldn't shake the memory of the salt-crusted hatches and the way the forest seemed to recoil from the valley's edge. The morning of the return trek was marked by a heavy, oppressive stillness that hung over the entire mountain range. The administrative coordinator moved with a surprising, silent efficiency, trailing behind the surveyors without uttering a single word of complaint or curiosity. They reached the first of the red markers within the hour, the plastic tape fluttering like a warning flag against the dark bark of a hemlock tree. Everything seemed in order, yet Penhaligon felt a growing knot of apprehension as they moved deeper into the primary forest. As they progressed, the markers began to lead them through terrain that felt subtly different than it had just days prior. The slopes seemed steeper, and the familiar landmarks, a lightning-scarred pine, a particular cluster of mossy boulders, were missing or shifted. They found the fourth marker, but the fifth was gone, leaving only a small, clean tear on a branch where the tape had been forcibly removed. The coordinator checked his watch, his face a mask of practiced indifference as the surveyors scrambled to find the path. By midday, they reached the limestone outcropping that had previously overlooked the concrete basin. Penhaligon climbed the jagged rock with a sense of triumph, ready to point out the massive gray facility to the skeptical official. But as he looked down into the valley, his breath caught in his throat. The concrete was gone. In its place was a lush, unbroken carpet of young saplings and thick ferns, looking as if they had been rooted there for a decade. The team descended into the basin, their boots sinking into soft, dark soil rather than striking hard concrete. There were no ventilation shafts, no steel hatches, and no rhythmic pulsing vibrating through the earth. Miller ran to the spot where he had found the clipboard, digging frantically into the dirt with his bare hands. He found nothing but wet clay and the tangled roots of mountain laurel, which appeared mature and undisturbed. Penhaligon paced the perimeter, looking for the edge of the concrete apron he knew had been there. He found a single, jagged shard of gray material embedded in the trunk of a tree at the basin's edge, but when he reached for it, the coordinator stepped in his path. The official calmly suggested that the team was experiencing topographical disorientation, a common side effect of the high altitude and exhaustion. He spoke in a low, soothing tone that felt entirely manufactured. The junior surveyors began to argue, pointing to the obvious signs of recent landscaping that the coordinator ignored. They pointed out that the trees in the center of the valley were of a different species and height than those on the perimeter, suggesting they had been transplanted. The coordinator merely smiled, noting that forest density often varies due to subterranean water tables. His refusal to acknowledge the physical evidence was more unsettling than the disappearance of the building itself. As they searched, Penhaligon noticed that the mature transplants were actually wilting, their leaves turning a sickly yellow despite the damp environment. He knelt to examine a fern and realized it wasn't growing from the soil, but had been pinned into the ground with heavy-duty iron staples. Underneath the layer of topsoil, his fingers brushed against something cold, flat, and unmistakably solid. He didn't say a word, sensing the coordinator's eyes boring into the back of his neck. The coordinator announced that the search was over, and that the team would be escorted back to the regional office for medical evaluation. He didn't ask them to leave, he commanded it with a quiet authority that suggested he wasn't alone in the woods. Shadows seemed to lengthen in the valley, moving independently of the sun as the fog began to roll back in from the peaks. The surveyors realized then that the forest was no longer a workspace, but a restricted zone. During the hike back, the team was flanked by 2 additional men in gray fatigues who had appeared silently from the brush. They didn't carry weapons openly, but their presence was a clear indicator that the administrative error was being handled with military precision. Nobody spoke, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of boots on dry leaves and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. Penhaligon kept his hand buried in his pocket, clutching the small, gray shard he had managed to palm earlier. Back at the ranger station, the atmosphere had shifted from professional to clinical. Their equipment was seized for calibration, and their personal effects were searched with a thoroughness that bordered on a criminal investigation. The team was separated into different rooms, and Penhaligon was left alone with a single flickering bulb and a stack of non-disclosure agreements. The silence of the station was deafening, a mirror to the silence of the valley they had just left. The interrogation lasted into the early hours of the morning, conducted by men who seemed to have no names or official titles. They didn't ask what Penhaligon saw, but rather insisted on what he hadn't seen, repeating the phrase topographical disorientation until the words lost all meaning. Every time he mentioned the concrete or the pulsing vibrations, the lead official would simply slide a fresh map across the table. The maps were dated 1958, yet they showed the valley as a pristine, untouched wilderness, as if the ink had dried decades before the team ever set foot there. By dawn, the surveyors were released and told that their contracts with the Geological Survey had been terminated due to medical incapacity. They were driven to the edge of the county line, in a vehicle with blackened windows, and left on the side of a quiet mountain road. Miller and the others refused to speak, their eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and a strange, hollow exhaustion. It was as if the valley hadn't just been erased from the map, but was being systematically erased from their own memories by the weight of the official denial. Stop transcription here. Years later, Penhaligon discovered a series of declassified logistical manifests from a defunct steel mill in Pennsylvania. The records showed a massive, unregistered shipment of lead-lined concrete and industrial-grade air filtration units sent to a Sector 7 in the Blue Ridge Mountains during the winter of 1956. There were no return receipts, and the company that ordered the materials, Aegis Environmental, had vanished from corporate registries within 6 months of the delivery. The coordinates for the delivery site were redacted, leaving only a black bar where the valley's name should have been. The most disturbing evidence came from a retired park ranger who, after a few drinks, spoke of the great transplant of the late 50s. He described convoys of flatbed trucks moving through the forest at night, carrying fully grown trees with their root balls intact and massive amounts of topsoil harvested from distant states. The ranger claimed that the entire topography of Valley 12 was reshaped in 72 hours, a feat of engineering that seemed impossible until one considered the sheer scale of the resources the government was willing to burn to keep the facility hidden. Penhaligon eventually tracked down a former maintenance technician for the Aegis Group, a man living under a pseudonym in a remote coastal town. The technician wouldn't say what the facility was built for, but he confirmed that the concrete basin wasn't a foundation, but a cap designed to seal a geological anomaly that had been accidentally breached during a deep well drilling project. He spoke of atmospheric venting and the necessity of burying the site under hundreds of tons of earth and biological camouflage to prevent the anomaly from being detected by civilian or foreign sensors. In his final years, Penhaligon returned to the Appalachian trailhead, but the access roads had been decommissioned and overgrown with a ferocity that seemed almost intentional. He sat by the old stone marker where the forest began, looking toward the peaks that guarded the ghost valley of Sector 7. He still possessed the small gray shard he had hidden in his pocket, a fragment of high-density concrete that felt unnaturally heavy for its size. Even in the warmth of the sun, the stone remained ice-cold to the touch, a physical remnant of a place that the world insisted was only a dream. The modern satellite images of the region show nothing but a seamless canopy of green, a perfect void in the middle of a vast national forest. There are no ruins to find, no concrete slabs to uncover, and no hatches to open. The earth has been smoothed over with bureaucratic and botanical precision. Yet, hikers in the area still report a strange phenomenon near the coordinates of the old survey. They speak of a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that rises from the soil during the coldest nights, a sound like a giant heart beating beneath the roots of the trees. The forest has a way of reclaiming what is lost, but some things are not lost. They are merely waiting in the dark. We are taught to trust our maps, yet we forget that maps are drawn by those who decide what we are permitted to find. Some secrets are not buried in files, but in the very ground we walk upon, covered by a layer of pine needles and half-century-old lies. If you ever find yourself in the deep Appalachians and the birds suddenly go silent, do not look for a path. Some places were removed from the world for a reason, and it is best not to knock on a door that has been buried.